morning, Jeremy.
I must say I'm quite enjoying our romp around the Pioneer Board, as it were. We should turn this into a board game, perhaps. You know, the Pioneers of Warrnambool board game. I don't know what would happen in the game, but anyway. Where are we going today?
Well, actually, the word romp sort of really resonated with me, but I don't think I'll talk about the romp down near the Mirror. That perhaps might bring up some from later years, not pioneers.
Oh, okay. I'll have to explain that another time.
Yes, perhaps. Yes. We'll just make sure that all the descendants of the people involved in the romp down near the Mirror are no longer likely to be listening.
Oh, okay, all right. I'm intrigued now. Anyway, moving on. Who have we got today?
I was going to talk about Joseph Aberline, and that's a name that's well known in Warrnambool. There's, of course, Aberline Road, and quite a number of Aberlines still live here, and I'm sure that they'd be interested in, though they possibly know anyway, but...
but if not, they could be in for a shock.
Yeah. No. Joseph Aberline was born in Oswestry in England in 1809 and came to Australia in 1835 after having married Martha Williams. And part of the reason that he came, of course, was that during the 1800s, Britain suffered a severe post-war depression, and there was terrible famine and mass unemployment, and many, such as Joseph and Martha, took a subsidised one-way passage to what was the other side of the world, really. Fairly brave move for a number of people. And we're lucky that we had these people who had capacity to make good in a new country come and help form the foundations of what we have here today. But Joseph and Martha arrived in Launceston in 1836. And despite that, in 1837 he was in Melbourne, I think still living in Launceston, but in Melbourne he went across, and in the second land sales in Melbourne he purchased Block 20, Allotment 20, in Melbourne for £39. Now, this was a block of land on the southeast corner of Queen's and Little Bourke Street. Right. So pretty central.
Yes.
What you might call position, I would think. And my research recently showed that it was an 18-storey brick-clad office building plus basement car parking for 18 cars. That's what's currently on there. Right. So if the family still had hold of that, it would be a substantial asset.
They could retire
quite
and
well.
enjoy the rest of their lives.
Yes, yes, of course. But not long after this purchase of land in Melbourne, the family moved from Tasmania and they settled well into the new community. And I think that when you talk about these things, people imagine Melbourne or Warrnambool or wherever we're talking about as being as it is now. But we have to imagine that, in 1838, the streets were not made. The buildings were, in many cases, almost temporary. There were, of course, some substantial buildings, but, it was very, very different from...
very, very rough and ready.
Yeah, that's right. So Joseph became part of the building committee for the independent church in Collins Street, which seems as if, when you look at now, as if it's been there forever, but, he was part of that development of that. And in November 1838, Mrs. Aberline opened a Tuscan straw bonnet establishment in Queen Street. Now, I think that sounds lovely. I would quite like to have a Tuscan straw bonnet establishment in Queen Street.
Obviously, there was a huge demand for them at the time.
Yes, the novelty might wear off, but I think it has sort of a really lovely air about it. Yeah. But they weren't people to sit in their hands for long, and in 1840 the Aberlines left for New Zealand and the Bay of Islands. And Joseph acquired land there, and so considering they had an assisted passage, they obviously had some capital to allow the purchase of this land that they've acquired in Melbourne and then later in New Zealand and the Bay of Islands. So, but the stay there was relatively short-lived because the Maori grievances sort of started to rear their heads, and this led to the entire settlement population in that area being taken by boat to Auckland.
Right.
So it was the beginning of the Maori Wars, and they obviously decided it was time to move on. So really being a pioneer and doing these things was not
Not a walk
easy.
in the park, no.
No, it was not a walk in the park. And when you look back on history, it might seem as if they, in some ways, had a privileged life, that they had money to buy property and so forth and move around a bit. But I'm sure it was really, really hard work. But the family arrived in Warrnambool in 1849, and this was very early in the city's history because the first land sales were held in 1847. So, they were fairly early on the ground. But, me talking a moment ago about the comfort and whatever of people in those early days. This is a quote about Warrnambool from Victoria and its metropolis, past and present. And it stated that, as showing the scarcity of ordinary requirements of civilisation in the early days, it is a humorous tradition in the Aberline family that Mrs. Aberline owned the first chair in the district. Now, I think that's interesting, isn't it? That it's noteworthy, newsworthy,
having a chair, yes,
that Mrs. Aberline had a chair.
Right.
And I suppose everybody else was sitting on sort of tree stumps and,
or whatever they could find. Yeah.
But it was certainly, obviously, an honour and a sign of privilege that she had a chair.
I wonder if it was on display, if people could come and see the chair.
Or maybe have a sit.
Try it for yourself, yes.
And I wonder if it's still in the Aberline family, because it is a significant item.
Yeah, maybe
really significant.
Maybe no one realises. It might just be sitting in a corner somewhere and no one knows that it's...
Yes, and possibly no one sits on it because it's perhaps a little rickety.
Yes,
Well, but Joseph, after he came to Warrnambool, he bought some land in Timor Street, opposite the post office at the end of Glenys Street. So that's sort of roundabout where the De Grandies, or the entrance into the Ozone car park, I suppose, roundabout there. So he's pretty good at the position stuff. I think he seems to have that down pretty pat.
Yeah.
But in 1854, he bought 2 country lots in the parish of Wangoom. Now, country lots is the interesting bit there, because Janet had previously talked about the Tui estate and the names of some of the streets there. I mean, this country lot we're talking about was across the road, effectively. So it very much was on the outskirts of Warrnambool. Warrnambool was just a fledgling little township at that stage. So in 1856, the Aberline family moved to 3 Chain Road and they farmed the land there. And they had to remove quite a number of rocks from that property because that hill up the top of Dooley's Hill or up around Wangoom Road is basalt country. There's a lot of clay and the rocks sort of come up to the surface there, so if you want to farm you have to get rid of the rocks. And they removed a lot of those from their property and they were carted to into Warrnambool, and they were used for the building of the breakwater, the base of the breakwater. So I dare say a number of farmers were doing the same thing. But Joseph also had a well-known orchard and grew vegetables, and in one instance he grew a cauliflower weighing 24 pounds, which is just...
I've heard about this legendary cauliflower.
This is just amazing. I mean, I have been to the supermarket and picked up cauliflowers and put them in the little weighing machine that they have there. It's 12 or 13 cauliflowers.
Right, yeah.
To get up to 24 pounds. It really is quite amazing. It's one big cauliflower.
Wow. And we don't know what his secret was or what he did with it, or... No,
but obviously he was a talented farmer, wasn't he? Or vegetable grower at any rate. You would imagine that also his orchard was renowned as well. So he would have been someone who knew how to work the land well.
Yeah. If only the Warrnambool show had been in existence, then he would have won first prize with that, do you think?
Right. Yeah, well, Joseph certainly was a talented man, and he prospered, and he had farms at Wangoom, Talangata, Killambeat, and the property that I mentioned in Timor Street and others in Lava Street as well. But we talked before about the images that are on the Pioneer Board, which is a very large board that we haven't been able to track one as large and, of course, as beautiful anywhere. We've had a historian do an assessment of it, so we know that it is special. But I don't know where they got the image from Joseph for the board, but I think he's sort of has a vague resemblance to a cauliflower. It's not it's not a particularly flattering. I spoke about John Shanks Jenkins before, and he's quite an elegant-looking man, and this fellow isn't. I know a number of descendants of Joseph Aberline that still live in
They won't
Warrnambool,
mind you saying that.
and they absolutely no resemblance to a cauliflower at all.
So something improved along the way there.
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Glenys, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy.
We'll catch up with you soon.